Philadelphia, spring 1799. The city of brotherly love, the crucible of American liberty, is in a state of nervous transition. John Adams is president. The Alien and Sedition Acts have cast a pall over the high-minded ideals of free speech, and the threat of war with France, the so-called quasi-war, looms like a thunderhead. But the political storms brewing in the streets are nothing compared to the quiet, devastating crisis unfolding behind the unassuming brick facade of the State Department. The State Department, at the time, was less a massive bureaucracy and more a small, essential operation. Its most priceless asset, its very raison d'être, was not the men who worked there, but the archives of the Continental and Confederation Congresses. These were not mere historical documents, they were the proof. They contained the final signed drafts of the treaties, the minutes of the secret debates, the original commissions of George Washington and the other revolutionary generals, the first official copies of the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. In an era before mass printing, these originals were the sole, unimpeachable legal foundation of the United States. To lose them was to lose the ability to prove America existed as a sovereign entity. And they were disappearing. The man in charge of these sacred papers was a clerk named Timothy Matlack, a Revolutionary War veteran with a flair for both patriotism and self-promotion. Matlack, however, was a figure of contradictions. A staunch patriot who had once signed currency for the colonies, he was also deeply in debt and possessed a dangerous sense of entitlement. He believed his service to the nation was inadequately compensated, and this simmering resentment provided the perfect opening for the ghost that walked the archives. The ghost had a name: Louis-André Pichon. Pichon was a French diplomatic agent, a man with the smooth manners of a courtier and the sharp instincts of a predator. France, under the increasingly aggressive Directory, saw the young American Republic less as an ally and more as a fledgling competitor, a former client state in urgent need of political and economic destabilization. The quasi-war was a diplomatic struggle waged on the high seas, but Pichon recognized that a far more decisive blow could be struck on land, in the very heart of American authority. Pichon's genius lay in his perception of Matlack's weakness. The French agent cultivated the disgruntled clerk not through outright bribery, a gesture that might have been too obvious, but through a slow, insidious process of flattery, sympathetic listening, and the promise of future significant French contracts that would supposedly enrich Matlack greatly. The initial disappearance was a slow drain, a trickle of single documents that could be easily dismissed as misfiling or simple archival decay. A ledger here, the confidential letter there. But by the late summer of 1799, the trickle had become a hemorrhage. Whole, heavy wooden boxes of state papers, marked secret acts and confidential correspondence, were systematically removed from the State Department's nascent archive rooms, spirited away under cover of the chaotic late-night moves of the government between temporary offices. Matlack, driven by his self-justifying rage and debt, had convinced himself he was simply safeguarding them for a future administration that would truly appreciate his genius, perhaps for a French-aligned party that would rise to power. Pichon, meanwhile, knew the true value of the cargo, leverage to dismantle the very foundation of the American government. The papers were secretly transported from Philadelphia, not to France, but to the newly established strategically neutral port of New Orleans, a Spanish possession at the time and a hotbed of international intrigue. Pichon's plan was simple, yet devastating. Once the U.S. government realized the extent of the loss, they would be forced to negotiate with the French to prove the legitimacy of their own treaties and land titles, plunging the young nation into constitutional chaos and economic ruin. The crisis broke not with a bang, but with the quiet, meticulous work of a newly appointed, low-level clerk who possessed a terrifying eye for detail. His name was James Monroe, a future president, but then a man recovering from a frustrating, near-disastrous stint as minister to France. Having seen the French diplomatic machine up close, he was acutely aware of the danger. In late 1999, while conducting an inventory, a procedure Matlack had constantly delayed, Monroe discovered the horrifying truth. The records of the First Continental Congress were largely intact, as was the official copy of the Declaration of Independence, but the bulk of the working documents, the committee reports, the financial journals, the sensitive diplomatic cipher keys, the essential record of debates from 1779 to 1885, including all the papers relating to the pivotal Treaty of Paris, 1783, were gone. A deep, hollow space in the archive shelves mirrored a black hole in American sovereignty. Monroe's discreet report landed on the desk of Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, a man known for his rigid federalism and explosive temper. Pickering understood the magnitude immediately. This was not a minor theft of jewelry, it was an act of political terrorism. Yet he also knew that a public disclosure would be catastrophic. The country was already politically polarized. Revealing that the foundational documents were missing would embolden European rivals, shatter public confidence, and likely trigger a constitutional crisis where states might question the legitimacy of the federal government itself. The search had to be invisible. Pickering turned not to the military or the existing threadbare constabulary, but to a shadowy network of informants and former intelligence assets that had served during the Revolutionary War, a proto-secret service composed of merchants, diplomats, and private citizens whose patriotism was as strong as their capacity for discretion. The man chosen for the impossible task was David Titchener, a quiet, unassuming surveyor from New Jersey, whose real skill lay in cartography and deep knowledge of the sprawling, barely charted American interior, but who possessed a sharp mind for espionage. Titchener was given no badge, no formal commission, only a direct, unwritten order from Pickering. Find the papers and recover them at any cost, without attracting the attention of either the French or the American press. Titchener's investigation began by tracking Matlack's movements and sudden unexplained increase in private shipping expenses. Within weeks, Titchener's network of contacts, old Continental Army logistics men and loyal Philadelphia merchants, identified the clandestine route, a series of river voyages disguised as private freight moving slowly west across Pennsylvania, down the Ohio River, and finally down the mighty Mississippi towards the Gulf Coast. The trail led directly to New Orleans. New Orleans in 1800 was a polyglot city of vice and volatile intrigue, a jewel box of Spanish, French, and American ambitions, all bubbling under the surface. It was the perfect place for a great swindle to be completed. Titchener arrived in the humid, Spanish-controlled city in the summer of 1800, operating under the guise of a land speculator interested in new tracts in the Mississippi Territory. His true target? Louis-André Pichon's network. Pichon, confident in the success of his audacious plot, had already begun discreetly communicating with French officials in Paris, preparing for the diplomatic ultimatum he would soon deliver to the U.S. government. The papers were stored in the heavily guarded, French-aligned consulate warehouse, hidden among crates of fine wines and imported goods. Titchener realized that a direct confrontation would be disastrous, likely resulting in an international incident and the destruction of the papers. He had to employ a classic counter-espionage maneuver, the double bluff. He found his key in a figure named Le Renard, the Fox, a notoriously slippery French merchant turned smuggler who had a long-standing, complicated relationship with Pichon and even greater love for hard American currency. Titchener didn't appeal to Le Renard's patriotism. He appealed to his greed and his deep-seated resentment of Pichon's arrogance.
Titchener, through a carefully orchestrated series of late-night meetings and coded messages, fed Leonard a compelling and entirely false story that Pichon had only brought the boxes to New Orleans as a temporary stopgap, and that he intended to sell the documents, the entire French advantage, to the Spanish governor in secret, pocketing the fortune himself and betraying Le Renard's own smuggling network. The rumor, perfectly tailored to the environment of betrayal and suspicion in New Orleans, took root immediately. Le Renard, fearing a cutout and a double cross, decided to preempt Pichon.
In the dead of night, using his intimate knowledge of the port's defenses, Le Renard and his crew executed their own, entirely new, audacious theft. They bypassed Pichon's guards, loaded the heavy boxes containing the very DNA of the United States onto a small, fast schooner and sailed not for the open sea as Pichon would have expected, but upriver, into the American-controlled Mississippi Territory. Le Renard's plan was to ransom the papers himself, cutting out both the French and the Americans for a truly enormous sum. Titchener had successfully used one criminal to snatch the evidence from a spy, but now he had to contend with an unpredictable, heavily armed bandit. The chase that ensued over the next 3 months was a forgotten legend of the early American frontier, a pursuit that predates the romanticized river sagas by decades. Titchener, traveling light and fast with a small, trusted contingent of veteran boatmen, followed Le Renard's increasingly desperate movements up the winding, untamed Mississippi. Le Renard, realizing Titchener was on his heels, started sending out bizarre communiques to American officials in the nascent territory, demanding a massive sum of gold and the promise of absolute immunity in exchange for the Spanish papers. The American officials, unaware of Titchener's secret mandate, were baffled by the demands, assuming the papers related to Spanish land titles, not the bedrock of the U.S. government. Titchener intercepted one of Le Renard's couriers near Natchez, Mississippi, and finally confirmed the contents of the boxes. He abandoned his surveyor persona entirely, gathering local militia assets and an old armed keelboat. The final confrontation occurred not in a dramatic shootout, but in a small, isolated trading post on the Arkansas River in the autumn of 1800. Le Renard, exhausted by the relentless pursuit, the heat, and the realization that no official American government would truly negotiate with him, was trapped. Titchener's team cornered the fox. There was a brief skirmish which resulted in the immediate capture of Le Renard and the recovery of the wooden boxes. The great swindle was undone. The documents, scuffed, water-stained, and bearing the humidity of the southern climate, but miraculously intact, were quietly, almost reverently, loaded onto Titchener's boat. The surveyor-turned-spy was given the task of the return journey, a more perilous voyage than the pursuit itself, as he now guarded the most precious cargo in the Western Hemisphere. Titchener and his crew arrived in Washington, D.C., the new, mud-caked capital, in early 1800, just as the bitter election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson was being decided. The documents were handed over directly to the State Department, where they were meticulously inventoried and placed into permanent fireproof security. The extent of the theft was never made public. The official story became a minor misplacement during the government's move from Philadelphia. Matlack was quietly dismissed, Pichon was eventually recalled to France, and Le Renard vanished into the Spanish prison system. The security measures for the National Archives were immediately and permanently overhauled, making a repeat of the swindle an impossibility. The consequences of Titchener's quiet success were monumental. The recovery of the documents secured the legal legitimacy of the entire American enterprise, allowing the government to function without the constant threat of foreign blackmail. Most astonishingly, the story remains a footnote in official histories, overshadowed by the very documents that were saved. The Great Swindle was an invisible crisis, a near-death experience for the Republic that was intentionally erased from public memory by the Founding Fathers to protect the fragile confidence of the new nation. It is a true testament to the quiet, determined patriotism that often operates beneath the headline-grabbing drama of history.
and a stunning reminder that America, the nation of self-evident truths, was once just a box of stolen papers, one river voyage away from erasure.